The scent of time clung to Elara Vance's skin like a second self, a faint, dry perfume of aging paper, leather, and decaying glue. In the hushed sanctuary of her workshop, she was a surgeon of memory, her delicate fingers tracing the fractured spine of a 17th-century mariner's atlas. Each precise movement, every carefully applied drop of adhesive, was a small act of devotion, a way of imposing order on the chaos of decay. At 28, her life had become a reflection of her craft, meticulous, quiet, and profoundly solitary. She mended the broken stories of others while her own remained sealed, its pages untouched, and its binding still stiff with newness. A deep, hollow ache resided in her chest, a space that no amount of professional fulfillment could ever hope to fill, a constant, silent reminder of a life lived at a careful remove. If you want to discover what broke her so completely that she built a fortress around her own heart, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you are watching from. We continue. Her town, Port Blossom, was as much a character in her story as she was. It was a place caught in the amber of its own history, where fog rolled in from the sea not as weather, but as a recurring ghost, blurring the lines between the present and the past. The salt-laced air corroded everything it touched, from the iron gates of the old estates to the ambitions of the young. Generations of families were rooted in its damp soil, their secrets and grudges tangled beneath the surface like the roots of ancient oaks. For Elara, the town wasn't quaint. It was a beautifully crafted cage. Its unspoken rules of propriety and appearance were the bars, and the constant, oppressive weight of its history was the lock, a legacy she was born to uphold, even as it slowly suffocated the woman she might have become. Elara Vance was a conservator of fragile things, a guardian of narratives that had outlived their authors. Her work demanded a patience that bordered on monastic, a deep reverence for the past that she had learned to substitute for a future. The irony was a bitter pill she swallowed daily. She could resurrect the faded ink of a forgotten poet, or stitch together the map of a world that no longer existed, yet she could not mend the fundamental tear in her own timeline. Her hands, so skilled and confident in their work, were strangers to intimacy. They had never been held with lingering intent, never traced the jawline of a man or been lost in the fabric of his shirt. Her virginity was not a statement of piety or a conscious choice, but a silent, unyielding fortress built brick by brick around a wound too deep to expose. The architect of that fortress was a ghost named Julian Croft. He was 12, all sharp angles and a shy, intelligent gaze, the first and only boy who had ever seen the world with the same quiet intensity as she did. Theirs was a summer of shared secrets whispered in the town library and promises made under the sprawling branches of the old willow by the pier. Then, overnight, he was gone. His family vanished, swallowed by a scandal that the town elders spoke of in hushed, condemning tones. He left without a word, a goodbye, or an explanation, taking with him the part of Elara that knew how to trust. The sudden, violent silence of his absence became the defining sound of her life, a void she unconsciously decided no one else could ever be worthy enough, or dangerous enough, to fill. This internal emptiness shaped the rhythm of her days. The walk from her workshop to the small, respectable house she shared with her mother was a journey through a landscape of what-ifs. She saw life happening around her as if through a pane of thick, distorting glass. She watched teenagers laugh on the town green, their easy affection, a language she had never learned to speak. She saw couples strolling hand in hand along the waterfront, their shared glances a form of currency she did not possess. It wasn't envy she felt, but a profound and sorrowful disconnect, the feeling of being a meticulously crafted replica of a woman, perfect in every detail, but lacking the vital, beating heart of lived experience. She was a spectator to the universal dramas of love and connection, forever seated in the back row. Her home offered no respite. It was a museum of the Vance family's former prominence, each piece of polished silver and every faded portrait a testament to a legacy that now rested squarely on her shoulders. Her mother, a woman whose own dreams had been pruned back by duty, ruled the house with a gentle but unyielding tyranny of expectation. Conversations were minefields of subtle suggestion and disappointed sighs. The topic of a suitable match, a union with a local heir who could restore their dwindling finances, was a constant low hum in the background of their lives. For her mother, it was a practical solution. For Ilara, the thought of such a transaction, of giving her carefully guarded self to a man she did not love for the sake of appearances, felt like the ultimate violation, a final, brutal tearing of her story's most precious, unread page. As night fell and the fog pressed against her bedroom window, obscuring the harbor lights, Ilara felt the full weight of her unwritten vow. It was a pact made not with God or with herself, but with the ghost of a boy who likely didn't remember her name. Her heart was a rare manuscript locked away in a vault. She had spent her life preserving it from damage, keeping it pristine and untouched, only to realize that a book that is never opened, never read, is no different from one that has been destroyed. It simply ceases to exist. She was a story waiting for a reader, a woman suspended between a past that had stolen her beginning and a future she was too afraid to write, trapped in the suffocating silence of her own life. The town of Port Blossom awoke not to the sun but to a slow, pearlescent diffusion of light through a persistent blanket of sea fog. For Ilara, each morning began with the same ritual of quiet containment. The air in the Vance house was cool and still, smelling of lemon polish and the faint, sweet decay of old roses her mother kept in porcelain vases. She moved through the dimly lit corridors like a phantom, her footsteps silenced by thick, worn carpets that had absorbed generations of secrets. Her reflection in the hallway's gilded mirror was a fleeting impression of a woman composed of shadows and muted colors, a figure drawn to blend into the background. Every gesture, from the careful way she poured her tea to the precise fold of her napkin, was a performance of the discipline and restraint that had been drilled into her since birth, a daily reinforcement of the invisible cage that was her life. Her breakfast with her mother, Beatrice, was an exercise in unspoken warfare. Seated at opposite ends of a long mahogany dining table, they communicated through a language of clinking silverware and loaded silences. Beatrice, a woman whose beauty had hardened into a kind of brittle elegance, would speak of the town's affairs with a detached precision. She'd mention the engagement of a distant cousin or the successful business merger of a family friend, each story a carefully aimed arrow at Ilara's solitary existence. Today, it was the upcoming annual Founders Gala, an event Beatrice insisted they attend. "The Hawthorns will be there, of course," she said, her gaze sharp over the rim of her teacup. "It's important we are seen." For Ilara, the words were not an invitation but a summons, another public inspection of the family's most valuable and yet unsold asset. After breakfast, the house itself seemed to conspire with her mother. The portraits of stern-faced Vance ancestors lining the grand staircase followed her with their painted eyes, their expressions a silent chorus of judgment. Their legacy was a heavy cloak she was forced to wear, one threaded with honor, but lined with the coarse fabric of debt. The family's prominence was a facade, a carefully maintained stage set behind which the coffers were nearly empty. Ilara was acutely aware that her mother's obsession with a suitable match was not about love or even happiness. It was a desperate, last-ditch business transaction. She was the currency that would settle their accounts and restore the family name. The thought of her body, her future, being bartered for financial security was a cold, physical weight in the pit of her stomach, a violation that felt almost inevitable. Her daily walk to the workshop was a journey through the very heart of her confinement. Port Blossom was a town of watchful windows and whispered histories. The salt-laced wind carried gossip as effectively as it carried the scent of the tide. As she passed the manicured lawns of the town's more prosperous families, she could feel the gazes of her neighbors, their curiosity, a tangible pressure on her skin. She was an anomaly in their ordered world, the unmarried Vance daughter, the quiet bookmender, a woman approaching 30 with no prospects to speak of. Their pity was more suffocating than their scorn. She kept her eyes fixed on the cobblestones, her posture perfectly straight, a mask of serene composure hiding the frantic beating of a trapped bird's heart. The town wasn't just her home, it was her audience, and she was perpetually on stage. Only within the walls of her workshop did the performance cease. The moment she closed the heavy oak door, the oppressive weight of Port Blossom lifted, replaced by the comforting, earthy scent of aging paper, leather, and binding glue. Here, she was not a daughter or a legacy or a problem to be solved. She was a creator, a healer. Her tools lay in perfect order, glinting in the soft light from the tall, arched window that overlooked the harbor. This small, cluttered room was her kingdom, the only place where she held absolute authority. She could mend the ravages of time, impose order on chaos, and give voice to stories that had been silenced. Yet, she knew this sanctuary was also a symptom of her affliction, a meticulously crafted world of inanimate objects that demanded nothing of her emotionally, a beautiful refuge that kept her safe from the messy, unpredictable business of living. The day's mail left on her doorstep by her mother contained a heavy, cream-colored envelope. The embossed crest in the corner was that of the Hawthorne family. It was an invitation to a private dinner, a precursor to the grand gala. Her mother's handwriting was on a small note clipped to it. "An opportunity, Ilara. Don't waste it." The name Hawthorne echoed in the silent workshop, representing everything she was supposed to desire, and everything she fundamentally rejected. They were the epitome of Port Blossom's old money power, a dynasty built on ruthless acquisitions and strategic marriages. Their heir, a man she barely knew but whose reputation for cold ambition was legendary, was the solution her mother had chosen. The invitation felt less like a social courtesy, and more like a summons to an auction where she was the prize lot. Later that afternoon, while sanding the edge of a worn leather cover, she glanced out her window and saw a young couple on the pier below. They were laughing, their bodies close, their intimacy effortless and unself-conscious as he tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The simple, spontaneous gesture struck Ilara with the force of a physical blow. It was a glimpse into a universe she only observed from a distance, a language of touch and affection she had never been taught. It wasn't the passion she missed, but the ease. The quiet, unspoken understanding that passed between two people who belonged to each other. In that moment, her solitude felt less like a fortress and more like a barren, desolate island, and the sea separating her from the rest of the world seemed impossibly wide and deep. The illusion of Vance's respectability was shattered for her later that evening. Passing her mother's study, she heard Beatrice's voice low and strained on the telephone. The words were clipped, desperate fragments. "Just a little more time. A misunderstanding. The gala will change everything." Ilara froze, the hushed conversation confirming her deepest fears. They were not just struggling, they were sinking. The carefully polished silver, the ancestral home, the pretense of a comfortable life. It was all a lie, propped up by extensions and promises. The pressure she felt was no longer a subtle atmospheric weight. It was a sharp, imminent threat. Her marriage to a Hawthorne was not just about restoring their status. It was about staving off utter ruin and public humiliation. The cage was shrinking, its bars now cold, hard, and undeniable. That night, her mother sought her out in her bedroom, her usual reserve replaced by a raw, uncharacteristic vulnerability. She didn't raise her voice or issue commands. Instead, she sat on the edge of Ilara's bed and spoke of her own marriage, of the sacrifices she had made for the family name. "Love is a fairy tale for girls who can afford it, Ilara," she said, her voice thin as parchment. "Respect, security, a place in the world. That is what a woman needs. That is what I am trying to give you." In her mother's tired eyes, Ilara saw not a tyrant, but another prisoner of the same system. A woman who had long ago traded her own heart for a gilded cage, and now believed it was the only safe place for her daughter. The realization offered no comfort, only a deeper, more profound sense of hopelessness. Alone in the dark, with the fog pressing against the glass like a ghostly hand, Ilara felt the full crushing weight of her fate. The choice being presented to her was no choice at all. It was a command to sacrifice the last piece of herself that was truly her own. Her untouched body, the physical manifestation of her unwritten story. Marrying a man she did not know, let alone love, for the sake of money and appearances, felt like a kind of death. It was the ultimate act of desecration, a tearing out of the pages of a book that had never even been opened. The vow she had unconsciously made to the ghost of Julian Croft, the vow to keep her heart locked away, no longer felt like a shield against pain. It felt like the only act of defiance she had left, a silent, desperate rebellion against a world determined to own her. The first tremor of his return was not a sound but a silence. It began as a hushed rumor in the town square. A whisper passed between merchants, that the entire historic waterfront was being quietly acquired by a single, faceless entity. A corporation from the city, they said, with bottomless coffers and no regard for Port Blossom's fragile history. For Ilara, the news was a distant threat, like a storm gathering far out at sea. Her workshop, nestled in the oldest part of the pier, felt immutable, a sanctuary carved from time itself. But then the official notices began to appear on the doors of neighboring businesses. Cold, legal documents that spoke of redevelopment and termination of leases. The storm was no longer distant. It was making landfall, and its invisible, powerful eye seemed to be fixed directly on the heart of her small, carefully ordered world. The name, when it finally surfaced, was delivered by the postman in a crisp corporate envelope. It was not a faceless corporation, it was a man. The letterhead was stark, minimalist, bearing only 2 words: Croft Enterprises. Ilara's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful intake of air. Croft, a name that had been systematically erased from the town's memory, a name she had not heard spoken aloud in 16 years. Julian Croft. The ghost of a boy with ink-stained fingers and a shy smile materialized in the quiet of her workshop. A phantom superimposed over the cold, hard reality of the man who now held her future in his hands. It couldn't be him. And yet, a cold certainty settled in her stomach, a dreadful, intuitive knowledge that the past was not just returning, it was coming back to claim everything. A few days later, she saw the car. It was a machine of silent, predatory elegance, a panther carved from obsidian and chrome that glided through the quaint, cobbled streets of Port Blossom as if it owned them. It was utterly alien to the town's landscape of weathered pickups and practical sedans. It parked before the newly renovated inn, a place locals now considered too expensive to frequent. A man emerged. Ilara watched from the distant safety of her workshop window, her heart hammering against her ribs. She couldn't see his face clearly, only a tall, imposing silhouette framed against the afternoon light. He moved with an economy of motion, a controlled and absolute confidence that radiated power. It was the walk of a conqueror, not the hesitant shuffle of the boy she remembered. In that moment, he was a stranger, a formidable force of nature she could not reconcile with the gentle memory she had guarded for so long. The formal summons arrived the next morning, a demand for a meeting delivered by a courier. It was not a request. The thick, cream-colored cardstock felt heavy in her hands, its embossed lettering cold and impersonal. The meeting was to be held at his temporary suite at the inn. The document was a stark symbol of the chasm that now separated them. She mended the fragile, personal histories of others, her work a testament to touch and care. He communicated through lawyers and corporate letterhead, his intentions conveyed with the sterile precision of a legal contract. She was a keeper of the past. He was a titan of a future she could not comprehend. As she held the card, she felt a tremor of fear mixed with a strange, defiant resolve. She would not be erased as easily as his family's name had been. She would face this ghost. The hotel suite was a world of cool, impersonal luxury. It was a space designed to be admired, not lived in, with vast panes of glass that offered a panoramic, godlike view of the harbor and the town below. The air was chilled to a precise temperature, and the only scent was the faint, chemical smell of newness. There was no clutter, no history, no soul. It was the antithesis of her workshop, a sterile void of glass and steel. Ilara felt small and out of place in her simple dress, a fragile, handmade thing in a world of mass-produced power. She stood in the center of the room, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, waiting. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic, silent beating of her own heart. This room was a reflection of him, she realized, a perfect, impenetrable fortress, designed to keep the messy, unpredictable world at bay. He entered from an adjoining room without a sound, his presence filling the space before she even turned to face him. The boy was gone. In his place stood a man forged in the fires of ambition and loss. He was dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed a part of him, an armor of dark gray wool. His face was all sharp angles and controlled planes, a handsome mask of severe discipline. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a winter sea, cold and deep. and they held no flicker of recognition as they swept over her. To him, she was merely an appointment, a minor logistical problem in his grand design. The cut was deeper than she could have imagined. To be looked at by the one person who had ever truly seen her, and be met with the blank gaze of a complete stranger. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice a low, resonant baritone that held no trace of the boy he had been. It was the voice of boardrooms and hostile takeovers, a voice accustomed to command and obedience. "Thank you for coming. I trust you understand the nature of my proposal for the waterfront. It's a matter of progress. Your workshop, while historically charming, occupies a prime location." He spoke with a detached clarity, laying out the terms of her eviction as if discussing a minor clause in a contract. Ilara felt a surge of cold fury. He was dismantling her life with the same impersonal efficiency he would use to dismantle a failing company. She found her voice, though it felt thin and reedy in the vast, silent room. "The history of that building is worth more than your progress," she managed to say. He gave a small, dismissive smile, a slight curve of his lips that did not reach his cold eyes. "History is a luxury, Miss Vance. Sometimes it needs to be cleared away to build something stronger." The condescension in his tone was the final spark. The years of silence, of waiting, of building a life around the void he had left, coalesced into a single point of defiance. She looked directly at him, letting the full weight of their shared past fill the space between them. "Is that what you did, Julian?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, but sharp enough to cut through his armor. The use of his first name, a name no one in this town dared speak, struck him with the force of a physical blow. The mask of the CEO shattered, and for a fleeting, breathtaking second, she saw him. His composure fractured. A flicker of something, shock, confusion, a pain long buried, crossed his features before being ruthlessly suppressed. The air in the room became thick, charged with 16 years of unspoken questions and unhealed wounds. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time, his gaze tracing the lines of her face as if trying to solve an impossible puzzle. The woman before him was not just a tenant. She was a ghost from a life he had tried to burn to the ground. He had returned to Port Blossom to exert his power, to rewrite his family's shameful history. But he had never anticipated that the past would have a face, a voice, and eyes that remembered him as a boy who made promises under a willow tree. The calculated negotiation had just become intensely, dangerously personal. The meeting concluded without a resolution. He did not withdraw his offer, nor did she surrender. He simply stood, his posture rigid, and dismissed her with a curt nod. "We will be in touch," he said. The words clipped, the professional mask back in place but ill-fitting now. As Ilara walked out of the sterile suite and back into the foggy, familiar air of Port Blossom, she was trembling. It wasn't just from anger or fear for her workshop. It was from the undeniable, terrifying current that had passed between them. In the moment his mask had slipped, she had seen not a monster, but the ghost of the boy she knew, trapped inside the cold, powerful man. A dangerous fascination had taken root in her heart, a desire not to fight him, but to understand him, to find the boy within the king. The silence Julian left behind in his hotel suite was a different entity from the familiar quiet of Ilara's workshop. His was a manufactured void, cold and absolute, while hers was a living silence, filled with the rustle of turning pages and the scent of history. Back in her sanctuary, she found she could not focus. The memory of his eyes, the brief, shocking flicker of recognition before the corporate mask slammed back down, was a foreign element introduced into her hermetically sealed world. It was a virus in the system, disrupting the careful code of her solitude. She ran a hand over the spine of a fragile poetry collection, but her fingers, usually so steady, betrayed a slight tremor. He had not just entered her physical space. He had breached the walls of her memory, and the past was now bleeding, fresh and vivid, into the sterile present she had so carefully constructed. From the panoramic window of his suite, Julian Croft watched the lights of Port Blossom flicker to life as dusk settled. The town he had intended to conquer and reshape with the indifferent force of capital now had a face. Ilara Vance. Her name was a ghost on his tongue, a key to a room in his mind he had sealed shut and tried to forget. He had built an empire on the foundations of ruthless logic and emotional detachment. Yet the quiet defiance in her eyes and the simple, devastating utterance of his childhood name had bypassed every one of his defenses. He poured a measure of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass, the ice clinking like a distant alarm. He was here for retribution, to erase a legacy of shame. He had not accounted for the possibility that the past would have a guardian, one whose quiet strength was a more formidable obstacle than any rival corporation. In the days that followed, a tense, unspoken war of attrition began. Julian did not send his lawyers or issue further ultimatums. Instead, his presence became a constant, unsettling pressure on the town's periphery. His sleek, black car would be seen parked on a cliffside overlooking the harbor, a silent, predatory shape against the gray sky. Ilara would feel his gaze on her as she walked to the market, a prickling on the back of her neck that was both a threat and a strange, unwelcome caress. He was studying her, she realized, not as a business impediment, but as an unsolved variable in an equation he thought he had already mastered. This silent observation was more unnerving than any open hostility. It was an invisible thread tightening between them, pulling her into an orbit she had no desire to enter, yet felt powerless to resist. Their next encounter was not in an office but on the old wooden pier as a thick evening fog rolled in from the sea, blurring the world into a palette of soft grays. Ilara was gathering her thoughts at the end of the day, watching the waves crash against the pylons, when his voice cut through the mist beside her. "It's a stubborn town," Julian said, his tone devoid of its earlier corporate chill. He wasn't looking at her, but out at the obscured horizon. "It holds on to its ghosts." Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. She didn't turn, keeping her eyes fixed on the water, the damp, salty air cold on her cheeks. "Maybe some ghosts don't want to be let go," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The space between them was charged, filled with everything they were not saying, the air thick with 16 years of silence. He took a step closer, the scent of his expensive wool coat and a faint, clean fragrance cutting through the brine. "My offer for your building is more than generous, Ilara. It's enough to start over, anywhere you want, a place without so many memories." The use of her first name was a deliberate, calculated intimacy, and it sent a shiver through her. She finally turned to face him, the fog swirling around them like a shroud. "This is my life, not a balance sheet you can liquidate," she said, her voice low but fierce. "You can't put a price on the one place a person feels whole." His expression tightened, and for a moment she saw a flash of something that looked like pain in his winter sea eyes. He was a man who had sold his own past. He couldn't comprehend someone who would fight to preserve hers. The encounter left her deeply shaken. His proximity had been a physical shock, a jolt to a system that had been dormant for her entire adult life. As she lay in bed that night, the fog pressing against her window, she replayed the moment on the pier. She had felt not only anger but a terrifying, magnetic pull. It was the undeniable connection to the boy he had been, a phantom limb that still ached after all these years. The man was a stranger, a ruthless force of destruction, yet beneath the tailored armor, she had sensed a profound loneliness that mirrored her own. For the first time, the fortress around her heart felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison, and the thought of him, the dangerous, forbidden thought of him, was the key turning slowly, inexorably, in the lock. Julian, too, was ensnared. He returned to his sterile suite and found it suffocating. He had his assistant compile a file on her, a dossier of a life lived in quiet opposition to everything he had become. He read about her scholarship, her meticulous work, her solitary existence. He saw the photos of her at town events, a figure always at the edge, her expression serene but distant. He was a man who dealt in assets and liabilities, but he could not categorize her. She was not a problem to be solved. She was a living testament to the life he had abandoned, a constant, quiet accusation. This growing obsession was a weakness, a dangerous distraction from his goals. Yet he found himself seeking out glimpses of her, needing to understand the woman who had survived the void he had created. The pressure from her family, meanwhile, was becoming unbearable. The Hawthorns had made their intentions clear. One evening her mother cornered her in the drawing room, her usual poise replaced by a brittle desperation. "The Hawthorns have made a very generous offer, Elara," Beatrice began, her voice strained. "Their son, Arthur, is a respectable man. This union would solve everything. It would save us." Elara looked around the room, at the faded tapestries and polished silver, and saw the truth. She was being sold to pay for these illusions. "It would be a lie," Elara whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "A life sentence." Her mother's face hardened. "It is your duty. It is the price of being a Vance." The cold, transactional nature of the proposal was a physical revulsion, a stark contrast to the chaotic, terrifying vitality she felt whenever she thought of Julian. This ultimatum sharpened her inner conflict into a razor's edge. The path her mother laid out was one of quiet suffocation, a loveless, respectable prison that would guarantee her family's security. It was the life she had always been groomed for, a continuation of her passive, controlled existence. Marrying Arthur Hawthorne would be the final closing of her book, its pages forever unread. Julian, on the other hand, represented a terrifying, unknown freedom. He was chaos, danger, the very man who had first broken her. Yet the thought of him ignited a spark of defiance, a wild, desperate yearning for a life that was her own, even if it meant being consumed by the fire. The choice was between a slow, certain death of the soul and the possibility of a spectacular, ruinous blaze. Driven by a desperation she didn't fully understand, she sought him out. She found him late one night, standing alone on the waterfront, the entire pier illuminated by the cold, stark lights of his proposed development project. He turned as she approached, his silhouette a dark, imposing line against the architectural renderings. "Come to surrender?" he asked, his voice laced with a weary irony. She shook her head, her coat pulled tight against the biting wind. "I came to ask you to stop," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "This isn't just about my workshop anymore. This is my home. You're tearing the heart out of it for what? Revenge? To prove something to ghosts who can't see you?" The raw honesty of her accusation hung in the air between them, stripping away the pretense of business. He stared at her, his face a mask of shadows and harsh light. "You know nothing about my reasons," he said, his voice a low growl. The control he so carefully maintained was beginning to fray at the edges. "I know what you did to me," she shot back, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, powered by years of repressed pain. "You vanished. You left a hole that nothing could ever fill. And now you're back to bulldoze the one thing I managed to build inside of it. You're trying to destroy my life for a second time." The accusation was a physical blow. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his jaw, as the full weight of her words landed. The boy who had fled in shame and the man who had returned for vengeance were colliding within him, and both were being judged by the woman he had wronged. The atmosphere between them crackled with an almost unbearable tension. The wind whipped a strand of her hair across her face, and without thinking, he reached out, his fingers brushing her cheek as he tucked it behind her ear. The touch was electric, a searing point of contact that sent a shockwave through Elara's entire body. It was the first time a man had touched her with such tenderness, and the fact that it was him, the source of her deepest wound, was a dizzying, painful paradox. His hand lingered for a fraction of a second too long, his thumb stroking her skin, his expression a maelstrom of confusion, guilt, and a dark, possessive hunger that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. She didn't pull away, she couldn't. In that single, charged moment, the nature of her dilemma shifted. It was no longer an abstract choice between safety and freedom. It was a visceral, physical reality. The safety of a life with Arthur Hawthorne was a cold, sterile tomb. The danger of Julian Croft was this terrifying, life-affirming spark that threatened to burn down everything she had ever known, including her own carefully constructed defenses. She saw in his eyes not a monster, but a man as broken as she was, his power a shield for a wound that had never healed. The desire to understand him, to reach past the armor and touch the ghost of the boy within, was becoming more powerful than her fear. It was a pull toward the one person in the world who could truly destroy her, or perhaps the only one who could ever make her whole. He finally dropped his hand, the air rushing back into the space between them, cold and sharp. His composure was shattered. "I never meant," he started, his voice rough, but he couldn't finish the sentence. What had he never meant to do? Leave her? Hurt her? Come back? The unspoken words hung between them, heavy with the weight of all the years they had lost. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just the quiet bookmender, but the girl he had left behind, now a woman whose entire life had been shaped by his absence. The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing force that threatened to bring him to his knees. He had returned to Port Blossom to reclaim his power, but he was quickly realizing he had lost it the moment he looked into her eyes. Ilara felt the shift in him, the cracking of his formidable facade. His vulnerability was more potent than any display of power. It called to a deep, dormant part of her, a part that wanted to heal, to mend, to soothe the very person who had caused her so much pain. This desire was a profound transgression against the vow of solitude she had unknowingly kept for 16 years. To want him, to feel this pull toward him, was to betray the girl who had waited, and the woman who had learned to survive without him. It was a desire for the one thing she had always told herself she could never have and should never want. A connection that was messy, unpredictable, and powerful enough to shatter her world. He turned away from her abruptly, staring back at the glowing schematics of his new world order, a kingdom of glass and steel. "Go home, Ilara," he said, his back to her, his voice strained with an emotion he refused to name. It wasn't a dismissal, it was a warning to her, to stay away from him, and a warning to himself, a desperate attempt to shore up his defenses against the one person who could dismantle his entire empire with a single, searching look. He was pushing her away, not out of cruelty, but out of a dawning, terrifying fear of the damage they could do to one another. He was resisting the pull, fighting an internal battle she was only just beginning to understand. She did not move, standing there on the windswept pier, with the ghost of his touch still burning on her skin. Ilara Vance felt the foundations of her life begin to crumble. The carefully constructed walls of her solitude, built brick by brick over years of quiet resignation, were no longer a fortress. They were ruins, and through the cracks a dangerous, beautiful light was beginning to shine. The dilemma was no longer a matter of logic or duty. It had become a primal, emotional imperative. Ceding to this overwhelming desire for Julian felt like a betrayal of everything she had been, but to deny it, to walk away and accept the cold security offered by the Hawthorns, now felt like the ultimate act of self-destruction, a final, irrevocable closing of her own story. The choice was no longer about saving her family or her workshop, it was about saving herself. For the first time in her life, she was confronted with the terrifying possibility of what she truly wanted, separate from duty, legacy, or fear. She wanted the chaos he represented. She wanted the answers to the questions his reappearance had unearthed. She wanted to feel the way his touch had made her feel, terrified, but incandescently, breathtakingly alive. The unwritten vow she had made to a ghost was being challenged by the devastating presence of the man, and she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and horrified her, that she was standing on the precipice of breaking it. The silk of the dress her mother had chosen was the color of old pearls, a lustrous, heavy fabric that felt less like a celebration and more like a beautiful, expensive shroud. Ilara stood before the gilded mirror in her bedroom, a stranger in her own skin. The woman staring back at her was a carefully constructed illusion. Hair swept into an elegant knot, a string of ancestral pearls cold against her throat. This was the version of Ilara Vance meant for public consumption, the pristine offering for Arthur Hawthorne. Tonight was the dinner that would seal her fate, a polite, civilized auction of her future. A wave of nausea, cold and sharp, rose within her. Every instinct, every fiber of the secret self she had guarded for so long, screamed in silent, violent protest. This was not a sacrifice, it was an erasure. She took one last look at the reflection, at the perfect, tragic bride of duty, and made a choice. It was not a grand, dramatic decision, but a quiet, seismic shift deep within her soul. With trembling fingers, she unclasped the pearls, their weight lifting from her skin like a breaking chain. She pulled the pins from her hair, letting it fall in a soft, unruly cascade around her shoulders. She slipped out of the silk dress, leaving it pooled on the floor like a shed skin, and pulled on her own simple clothes. Dark wool, soft cotton, the familiar armor of her true self. She moved through the silent, expectant house like a thief, her heart hammering a wild, terrifying rhythm of freedom. She didn't leave a note. The empty dress on the floor was a statement more eloquent than any words she could write. The fog had rolled in thick and absolute, swallowing the familiar streets of Port Blossom and transforming them into a ghostly, liminal space. Driving through the swirling mist was like navigating a dream, the world reduced to the narrow beam of her headlights and the muffled sound of the engine. She wasn't running away. She was running towards something, though she couldn't have named it. She found herself parked not outside his hotel, but in the dark, quiet lane behind her own workshop. This small, cluttered room was the only place she had ever been truly whole. It was her beginning, and she felt with a strange certainty, the only place this new, terrifying chapter of her life could possibly start. She unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of paper and time, a comforting balm to her frayed nerves. He found her there, as if he had known all along. She didn't hear him approach, but the air in the small space shifted, charged with his presence. He stood in the doorway, a tall, dark silhouette against the foggy night, his expensive suit looking utterly out of place amongst her scattered tools and stacks of aging books. He wasn't angry or triumphant. His face, illuminated by the single low lamp on her workbench, was etched with a deep, weary concern. "I knew you wouldn't go," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. He took a slow step inside, closing the door behind him and shutting out the rest of the world. The small workshop, her sanctuary, instantly became a crucible, the space between them shrinking until it was almost non-existent, filled with the suffocating weight of everything they had never said. He didn't speak of the Hawthorns or of business. Instead, he walked over to a stack of brittle, 17th-century maps she was restoring, his long fingers hovering over the faded ink. "My father was a cartographer," Julian said, his voice quiet, stripped of its corporate armor. He loved this town. He believed he was building something for it. The man who ruined him, who betrayed him, was Arthur Hawthorne's grandfather. He finally looked at her, and his eyes were not the cold winter sea of a CEO, but the haunted, stormy gray of a boy who had watched his entire world burn. "We didn't just leave, Ilara. We were exiled. They took everything and painted us as the villains. I came back to take it all from them, to erase their name the way they erased ours. That was all I wanted." Ilara listened, her anger and resentment dissolving into a wave of profound, aching empathy. She saw it all. The shame, the helplessness, the burning rage that had fueled him for 16 years. He was not a monster who had returned to destroy her. He was a man trying to mend a wound so deep it had defined his entire existence. He had built an empire of steel and glass as a fortress, around the fragile heart of a betrayed boy. In that moment, she understood him with a clarity that was both terrifying and absolute. He was just as trapped by the past as she was. His power, a different kind of cage. Her hands, the hands of a restorer, instinctively wanted to reach out, to smooth the lines of pain on his face, to mend the broken map of his life. His gaze fell upon a rare, illuminated manuscript she was working on, its vellum pages thin and fragile as a moth's wing. He reached out, not to touch her, but to trace the delicate, golden lettering with a single finger. His touch was impossibly gentle, a gesture of such profound reverence that it made her breath catch in her chest. It was the touch of a man who understood the value of fragile, irreplaceable things. "All these years," he whispered, his eyes still on the ancient page, "I thought power was about being unbreakable. But this is real strength, the ability to survive." He slowly lifted his gaze from the book to her face, and in his eyes she saw the same reverence, the same awe, the same gentle fear. He was seeing her, finally, as the precious, preserved story she was. He closed the small distance between them. The air crackled, thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and the clean, sharp fragrance of the night on his coat. He raised his hand, not to her cheek, but to the pulse that beat frantically at the base of her throat, his thumb resting there as if to calm the frightened bird of her heart. "I am so sorry, Ilara," he breathed, the words a raw confession, and then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or possession, but of homecoming. It was hesitant, searching, a question asked in the dark. She answered by leaning into him, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his coat, as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. The unwritten vow, the fortress of 16 years, crumbled into dust in the space of a single, shattering heartbeat. When they broke apart, they were both trembling, breathless. The single lamp cast long shadows, turning the workshop into an intimate, sacred space. The world outside, with its fogs and its duties and its ultimatums, had ceased to exist. There was only the sound of their ragged breathing and the ancient, silent witness of the books that surrounded them. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his perfect, controlled facade completely gone. In its place was a raw, aching vulnerability that mirrored her own. She had spent her entire adult life feeling like a spectator, watching life through a thick pane of glass. But now the glass was shattered, and she was in the heart of the storm, feeling everything with an intensity that was both painful and exquisitely, breathtakingly real. This single act had changed the very architecture of their lives. She had not just defied her mother, she had chosen a new allegiance, a new future. She had traded the cold, gilded cage of the Hawthorns for the dangerous, unknown territory of Julian Croft's heart. By allowing her to see his weakness, by confessing the truth of his past, he had given her a power over him that no amount of money could buy. They were no longer just a ghost and a guardian of the past. They were two broken halves of a single story, finally reunited. The consequences of this night would be a tidal wave, threatening to drown them both. But as he kissed her again, deeper this time, a kiss of promises and peril, Ilara knew with absolute certainty that she would rather drown in his arms than spend another day safely on the shore. The dawn that followed their kiss did not bring clarity, only a fragile, shimmering unreality. Ilara awoke in her own bed, the scent of him, a ghost of wool and night air, still clinging to her skin. The world outside her window, shrouded in the familiar gray fog, seemed unchanged. Yet everything within her had been fundamentally reordered. She touched her lips, the memory of his kiss, a phantom warmth, a brand of both promise and peril. The initial incandescent thrill was quickly being replaced by a creeping, cold dread. She had not simply chosen a man, she had chosen a storm. She had defied her family, her duty, and the entire architecture of her safe, solitary life. The silence of the Vance house, once merely oppressive, now felt sharp and accusatory. In the quiet corridors, she could almost hear the sound of the foundations of her world cracking beneath her feet. Her mother found her not in the dining room for breakfast, but in her bedroom, standing beside the pearl-colored dress, which lay on the floor like a casualty of war. Beatrice's gaze moved from the dress to Ilara's face, and in her eyes there was no fire, no recrimination, only the cold, dead ash of disappointment. It was the look one gives to a beautiful object that has been irrevocably broken. "You have ruined us," Beatrice said, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "You threw away security, respect, our very future, for a fantasy. For the ghost of a man who has already destroyed this family once." The words were not an attack, they were a verdict. In that moment, Ilara felt the final brittle thread connecting them snap. She was no longer a daughter. She was a liability, a failed legacy. The rejection was absolute. A silent excommunication that left her more alone than she had ever been in her life. Julian stood before the floor-to-ceiling window of his suite, the panoramic view of Port Blossom a map of his intended conquest. But the lines and strategies now felt alien, the cold logic of his revenge contaminated by an illogical, overpowering emotion. The memory of Ilara's workshop, the scent of old paper, the warmth of her skin, the terrifying vulnerability in her eyes as she kissed him back, had breached his defenses completely. He had spent 16 years building an empire on the principle of emotional detachment, and in a single night, she had dismantled it. He saw now that his return was never just about business or vengeance. It was an unconscious pilgrimage back to the scene of his first and greatest loss. But in finding her, he had given his enemies, the Hawthorns, a weapon. His obsession with her was no longer a secret. It was a weakness, a soft target in the center of his armored heart. A week bled into the next, marked by a silence that was heavier and more profound than the 16 years that had preceded it. Ilara heard nothing. No call, no message, no sign that the man who had shattered her world even remembered doing so. She sought refuge in her workshop, but the sanctuary was now a site of haunting. His presence lingered in the spaces between the books, his whispered confession echoing in the quiet air. The doubt began as a small, insidious seed and grew into a suffocating vine. Had he regretted it? Was she merely a moment of weakness? A nostalgic impulse he had already disciplined himself to forget? The old wound, the one carved by a boy's sudden disappearance, tore open again, raw and agonizing. She had traded her entire world for a single kiss, and it seemed he had already forgotten the taste of it, leaving her stranded on the shores of her own ruin. The consequence, when it came, was not delivered by Julian's hand, but by the cold, impersonal machinations of the law. A courier arrived at the Vance house with a thick envelope. Inside was a formal notice of foreclosure. The Hawthorns were calling in the secret debt that had kept her family afloat, a swift and brutal retaliation for her public defiance. The document was a death certificate for the Vance legacy. Beatrice didn't scream or cry. She simply placed the notice on the polished mahogany of the hall table, its stark, black print a final testament to Ilara's failure. Seeing it, Ilara felt a guilt so profound it was like a physical weight crushing the air from her lungs. Her single, selfish act of desire had brought about the very public humiliation and ruin her mother had spent a lifetime trying to avoid. The weight of that failure threatened to break her. But in the crucible of that guilt, something else was forged. Sitting alone in her workshop late one night, surrounded by the silent, resilient stories of centuries past, Ilara felt a shift deep within her. She looked at her hands, the hands of a restorer, and realized she had spent her life mending the damage done by time and neglect. Her own life was now a fractured, broken text, its spine snapped, its pages torn. The old Ilara would have seen it as a tragedy to be mourned, but a new, unfamiliar strength was stirring in her blood. She had lost her home, her family's approval, and the fragile hope of a future with Julian. In losing everything that had defined her, however, she had also been freed from its weight. She was no longer a daughter bound by duty, or a woman waiting for a ghost. She was simply herself, and for the first time she began to wonder what that self was capable of building from the wreckage. From his suite, Julian watched it all unfold. He had access to every transaction, every legal filing. He saw the foreclosure notice the moment it was processed. A primal, savage instinct roared within him, the urge to unleash the full, devastating force of his empire, to obliterate the Hawthorns, to swoop in and rescue her from the fire he had inadvertently started. But his mind, the cold, strategic engine that had built his fortune, held him in check. To act now, to reveal his hand so openly, would be a fatal mistake. The Hawthorns wanted him to react emotionally. They wanted to draw him into a public battle over her. To truly protect her, to dismantle their power structure from the inside out, he had to play the long game. He had to become the cold, indifferent ghost they all believed him to be. And so he did nothing, a calculated inaction that felt like the deepest betrayal of his own heart. They suffered in their separate prisons, separated by a few hundred yards of fog-shrouded town that might as well have been an ocean. Ilara packed boxes in the cavernous, silent rooms of the Vance house, each treasured object a fresh stab of guilt. She was an outcast, the subject of pitying whispers in the market, the foolish girl who had gambled her family's name on a phantom and lost. Julian sat in meetings, his voice a calm, authoritative instrument, while his mind was consumed by images of her. He moved millions of dollars, orchestrated complex corporate maneuvers, all while feeling utterly powerless to soothe the pain of the one person he had ever truly cared for. The intimacy of their kiss felt like a distant, impossible dream, and the chasm of silence he had created to protect her was now an unbridgeable void. One afternoon, the illusion of his protection shattered completely. As Alara was leaving the post office, her heart heavy with the day's burden, she saw him. He was descending the steps of the town hall, flanked by a team of lawyers in sharp, dark suits, his expression a mask of cool, unreadable composure. He had been meeting with the very town council that was rubber-stamping the Hawthorns. Legal assault on her family. As his black car slid to the curb, he passed within feet of her, his gaze sweeping forward, through her, as if she were nothing more than a pane of glass. The sight was a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. It was a confirmation of her deepest fear. The man in the workshop had been an aberration. This cold, ruthless stranger was the real Julian Croft, and she had been nothing more than a brief, sentimental detour on his road to absolute power. She walked back to the hollow shell of her home, but the guilt that had been crushing her was gone, burned away by the cold, clean fire of betrayal. She was no longer a victim of circumstance or a casualty of her own heart. She was a fool, and she would not be one any longer. She looked at the foreclosure notice still sitting on the hall table, but she no longer saw it as a symbol of her failure. She saw it as a challenge. She had been stripped of everything, family, home, love, but in that stripping, she had found a core of resilience she never knew she possessed. The quiet, timid bookmender who lived her life between the pages of other people's stories was gone. In her place was a woman with nothing left to lose and, therefore, nothing left to fear. A new vow took root in her soul, not to a boy's ghost, but to herself. She would not be a footnote in his story. She would be the author of her own. The day the Vance legacy was formally extinguished arrived not with a storm, but with the quiet, mundane finality of a key turning in a lock for the last time. Alara stood on the porch of the house she no longer owned, a single suitcase at her feet. The rooms behind her were hollowed-out shells, echoing with the ghosts of generations. Yet she did not feel the crushing weight of failure she had anticipated. The betrayal had cauterized the wound of her guilt, leaving behind a clean, hard scar of resolve. She had lost her history, her name, her place in the world. But in the stark emptiness of that loss, she had found an unshakable sense of self. She was no longer a fragile manuscript to be preserved. She was the author, and the page before her, though terrifyingly blank, was finally her own to write upon, in whatever ink she chose. A courier, a young man indifferent to the dramas of Port Blossom, interrupted her quiet departure. He handed her a thick, crisp envelope bearing the seal of a prestigious city law firm. Inside she found not another notice of defeat, but a series of documents that made the world tilt on its axis. The first was a legal notice stating the Vance family's outstanding debts had been settled in full by an anonymous benefactor. The second was a deed. Her breath hitched, her eyes scanning the dense, legal language until they landed on the property description. The entire historic waterfront building that housed her workshop, its ownership transferred, free and clear, into her name. It was not a grand, romantic gesture of rescue. It was a silent, surgical act of restoration, a quiet, anonymous apology, written in the cold, irrefutable language of the law, a language he knew she would understand. She didn't go to his hotel. Instead, she walked to the workshop, her key sliding into the lock with a new, profound sense of belonging. The space was no longer just a sanctuary. It was an anchor, a testament. He had not saved her from the Hawthorns. He had armed her. He had given her back the one piece of her life that was truly hers, fortifying it against any future attack. Standing amidst the scent of aging paper and binding glue, she finally understood the nature of his silence. It was not abandonment. It was the painful, calculated quiet of a strategist moving his pieces on a board far larger than she could see. He had made himself a ghost to the world, so he could fight a war for her in the shadows, a war he was still fighting. The realization was not a wave of relief, but a deep, resonant chord of understanding that vibrated in her very soul. As twilight bled across the sky, painting the fog in hues of violet and rose, she felt an undeniable pull toward the sea. She walked down to the pier, the damp wood cool beneath her feet. He was there, at the very end, a solitary figure staring out at the horizon where the water met the mist. He was not the titan of industry, flanked by lawyers and armored in a perfect suit. He was just a man, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to emanate from his very bones. He had won a battle for her, but the war for his own soul was clearly far from over. She did not call out his name. The air was too fragile for words. She simply walked toward him, each step a deliberate, conscious closing of the distance he had been forced to create between them. He turned as she approached, not with surprise, but with a quiet sense of inevitability, as if he had been waiting for her all along. The space between them was filled with the silent roar of everything they had endured, the betrayal, the guilt, the desperate, unspoken longing. His eyes, the color of a winter sea after a storm, held the full, devastating truth of his sacrifice. He had risked his entire strategy, his 16-year quest for vengeance, for her. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out his hand. He didn't offer her a jewel or a key, but a small, smooth gray stone, worn by the endless churning of the tide. It was a perfect skipping stone, identical to the ones they used to search for on this very beach as children. A relic from a story they had both thought was over. She reached out and took it from his palm, her fingers brushing against his. The stone was cool and solid in her hand, a tangible piece of their shared past and a silent promise for an unwritten future. It was not an ending, it was not a guarantee. The Hawthorns still existed, and the ghosts of their families still lingered in the fog-shrouded streets of Port Blossom. But it was a beginning, a choice to build something new from the wreckage. Together, the vow of solitude, made to the ghost of a boy, was finally and completely broken, replaced by a silent, shared pact with the man who had returned from the ashes to give her back her own story. If you want to witness the story they will write together from these ruins, I invite you to subscribe, like, share, and comment on what you would do in Alara's place.